Hello and welcome to Insert Show Name Here. This is Cailey.
This is Lindsay.
This is Jackson.
And today we are going to be talking all about New Hampshire as they approach their primaries. We have been in the state since Hailey touched down on Tuesday and have been speaking to voters since.
Today we will be highlighting our visit with Hailey at Good Morning New Hampshire with Jack Heath, our talks with New Hampshire voters, and our overall thoughts on how New Hampshire primaries are going.
Lindsay and I will be giving the in-depth analysis of what is happening in New Hampshire while Cailey talks about her interviews with New Hampshire voters. And right now, we will be talking about our radio visit where Nikki Haley talked.
So obviously we need to talk about Nikki Haley and how she was on the show. What do you guys think? Do you think what she was saying aligned with what she's been saying so far? Is her messaging consistent?
I think she's been really consistent with her messaging, and I think that's something very deliberate. Attacks from DeSantis and Trump have been coming at her a lot, trying to paint her as more liberal or not appealing to Republican voters. And so I think she's really trying to nail down her messaging, specifically about the border, about school choice, about, core Republican values, to remind them why she is, she's not MAGA Donald Trump, but she is a Republican candidate at the end of the day.
And I would agree with that for the most part. I would also say, just building on that, when we saw her at the rally after we were at the radio station with her, she kind of adopted a couple more extreme Republican talking points in terms of talking about, sanctuary cities and term limits. Those were things that she hadn't really harped on before. And so I thought it was interesting that she kind of switched up to that after there was some conversation online and on the media about whether or not Nikki Haley was too liberal to be a conservative running for office. And there were a lot of criticisms associated with that. So I think that she has acknowledged that and that she is actively working to not necessarily change her message, but sort of retrofit it in a way that more appeals to a conservative voter base.
I agree. And I think a lot of the times when we look at presidential politics, when you're in the primary, you run to the extreme of whatever party you're in. And then come the general, that's when you run more towards the middle to appeal to a lot of independents or moderate voters on both sides. And I think Nikki Haley really started off trying to appeal to moderate and independent voters, trying to sway possibly some Democrats who don't love Joe Biden and a lot of Republicans who are just fed up with the far right side. And I think she's been really criticized with that. So she's going back to sort of that traditional campaign tactic of, all right, let's go more to the right and get some more Republican voters in order to secure our base within the party.
Yeah, I think it's a healthy mix of her core values, like she's still pro leaving abortion rights up to the states, which is generally a more conservative value that is not popular with conservatives anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's definitely something that's going on. I would have to agree with you.
And, what about what she mentioned with ushering in a new generation and securing the future for the children? Do you think that type of perspective helps her, or do you think it doesn't give her much of a leg up when compared to her other competitors?
I think that that's a huge advantage for her. I think a lot of people's main criticism of a Trump-Biden matchup in the potential general election is that they're both so old, that they're both been in the old guard, that we need new people in politics. We need a new generation of political leaders on both benches to step up to the plate. And so I think that she is harping on that, and that she actually fits into the category that she is describing is a huge advantage for her campaign. And I think it's why a lot of people are really impassionate about voting for her.
I agree completely. I think her age plays a huge part in this. I think also just when she talks about speaking for the children of America and the new generation, she has kids who are a part of our generation. And I think sometimes when Joe Biden or Trump talk about this new generation, it gets lost in the shuffle because the people they're referring to are their grandchildren. And I think for her being like, these are for my kids. Politics is personal, whether you want to believe that or not. And I think her harping on that and saying, my kids, need this and need that, and I want to do this for them. I think that really speaks to a lot of voters who are saying, yeah, I'm voting for you because I'm voting for the future. I'm voting for our kids, and knowing that you will work, as a president, maybe a 2-term president, to ensure this future and build it up.
Yeah. And so last thing I think we should probably touch on about her radio visit. She said that she would not debate DeSantis again and that she would only debate Trump, which then resulted in the ABC debate being canceled on Thursday. Do you think that hurt her? Was that even a smart move?
Listen, as an individual, I think that makes a lot of sense for her. Why debate down when you could debate up? As a political move, specifically in New Hampshire, I do not think it was smart. I think a lot of New Hampshire voters felt slighted. I think a lot of them felt like she wasn't stepping up to the plate, with, rumors of the DeSantis campaign sort of falling apart and not being organized. If he were to drop out, his voters, most of them go to Trump. And so I think she needs to keep him in this race for his voters to stay there and for her to continue to build her base. And so while I understand where she was coming from about, wanting to debate the next person up, I don't think politically it was smart.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I think that one of the calculated risks that probably went into making that decision was if Nikki Haley performs well at the debate, does that cause DeSantis to drop out after that debate? And I agree with your point that if DeSantis drops out, especially this early on in the race, that would be really bad for Nikki Haley because a lot of those voters would jump to Trump. And so I think that this decision was a calculated decision. I think that there are definitely pros and cons from both a political standpoint coming from Haley's camp as well as the local New Hampshire voter that's going to the polls. So it's just a really weird situation. This is a really weird election. And so I'm not really sure how to judge a lot of these decisions, at least from a political standpoint.
Totally. And I think just on a last point of money, debates, when a candidate debates, there's all this media afterward. And so if you can come up with a good soundbite that the local news is going to play and repeat, that's free media for you. And I think she missed that specifically in how well she's done in debates in the past with DeSantis.
Let's move on to our next topic of discussion. So we were able to go around and talk with some voters, and we were able to speak to some at the Red Arrow Diner in Manchester, some at the DeSantis Town Hall in Derry, and some at Haley's Meet and Greet in Hollis. So let's start with our first New Hampshire resident. His name was Michael Irwin. He identifies as an independent, and when posed with how he thinks the political field is at the moment, he feels strongly that we need more candidates from other parties to get a time in the spotlight.
But I really wish that we could open up more than a bipartisan. So other representatives like, RFK, who's running as an independent, has a chance to come in and speak to, the younger generation, or anybody else on that matter. Right now with the bipartisan, it's almost as if, two parties rule it all. And if you're not in the club, you're not allowed to be involved. So.
Now, what are you guys taking away from this?
I think that this is a more popular view amongst the general voting public than most people realize. I think a lot of people would identify themselves in a more centrist manner, which kind of leads to this desire to have less extreme candidates running for both sides. So I feel at this point, specifically pointing to Donald Trump's first 4 years in office, politics kind of really moved away from the white picket fence in the middle to very extreme sides on both sides. And so I can understand why there is a desire to have more centrist candidates and bipartisan candidates taking place in the election. I don't necessarily know if I would agree with that take, just because I don't think that centrists have the ability to get a lot done in leadership, but it does generally reflect a general will of the public at this point, I believe.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think also, I don't know when, if ever, this will happen in American politics, but I don't think independents have the ground and the stamina that it takes to win a general election. And so I think even if you had someone like Joe Manchin or you had Nikki Haley running independently, I think people are so tied to the D or the R next to a candidate that running independent really hurts people. Mm-hmm. I also am interested that he said that RFK was for the younger generation. As someone a part of that generation, I think RFK speaks a lot on the environment, which is really interesting. But I think with a lot of his comments he's made, it isolates a lot of people and it is not very inclusive language. And so I'm interested that he was sort of identified as someone running for the younger generation. But yeah, I agree. I think bipartisanship is a huge thing nowadays, and I think a lot of people want that. I think it's a double-edged sword. People want it, but they're not willing to give up their values if they fall more left or more right.
Yeah, and I would say I think RFK is an interesting example to use for that argument, simply because besides his weird situation with the vaccines, he tends to have really far left policies when it comes to base income and economics and all of that. And so I would argue that that's not really somebody who falls outside of partisanship, because it's very clear besides very limited amount of policies that he would in any other election probably be labeled as a Democrat.
Right.
Yeah, and I know when I was speaking to him, he was very keen on voting for the RFK campaign. But of course, if there was another Trump-Biden matchup, which seems to be what's going to happen, he would vote for Trump. And he did point out that both candidates were same birds of a feather, which was kind of interesting for me, being both of them are technically considered more extreme in their views in some sense. And yeah.
That's really interesting because I don't view Biden to be an extremist at all.
I don't either.
Yeah, I feel like he's almost like if you look at politics on a global spectrum, he falls on the right in like almost every other country's political system.
I think too, same birds of a feather. If you look at their upbringing, like Biden has been in politics and government for so long. He was vice president. He was in the Senate. And Trump is a businessman, and he very much prides himself on businessman turned quote unquote politician. And so I think same birds of a feather if you look at them, but I don't think their pasts are that similar at all, really.
For sure.
Yeah, more in the superficial sense rather than like the deeper looking into both of their histories kind of sense. I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Our next person we met while attending the DeSantis Town Hall in Derry. Natalie Branken is a mother of 4 supporting Ron DeSantis. She spoke of her concerns on the standard of life in America and how inflation is a main issue in affording groceries and other essential budget items.
The economy is a big one. We're really feeling the pain right now with inflation. And so, we're very frugal, but things are tight. So
I think this is interesting. I feel like Biden has done a great job in, reducing inflation and slowing it down and all this sort of things. But I feel like he's not doing a good job of communicating that to the public. And so I think if you hear that inflation is bad and it's awful and all of these things, you are more likely to believe that. However, I also do empathize with, I'm sure this is an issue for Natalie and for her family. And so I think interesting to pick DeSantis. I don't really feel like he's the family candidate. I don't know if there is one, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say I was interested to hear this just because of the talk of how statistically good the economy is right now.
Yeah.
And the majority of people that we've talked to on both sides of the aisle have really stressed the fact that they're not feeling that they're still feeling really squeezed when it comes in terms of buying prices. And so I also would agree that I think DeSantis is an interesting person to choose to throw their support behind if this is a big issue for them. Because I feel like a lot of the talk that's coming out of this talking point is a sign of a growing class divide. And I feel like that also points to the taxation system in America in terms of people are unwilling to make enemies with the rich and powerful by increasing their tax brackets in order to add additional relief to those who are in less high income brackets. And so I think that that's an interesting person to choose because as far as I'm aware, Ron DeSantis is not pro taxation of the most rich.
No.
And so I think that is a very interesting stance to take as a DeSantis supporter.
Yeah, and I think something else we can kind of take away from our conversation with her was that her children were her main priority when making decisions on which candidate to vote for. Do you think this is like a trend of some sort, or do you think this has always been a thing?
I think this is always a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Politics is personal, and when you talk about, it's not just Natalie's future, it's her kids, it's her grandkids, it's her family. I think especially if you feel like you're feeling the pressure of inflation, what the president's going to do next is going to impact what you eat every night, where your kids go to school. Are you able to, spend time on a vacation together, all these sorts of things. And I think specifically for parents, they think of their kids when it comes to education, financial security, all these different types of things. So I don't think it's a trend. I think it's reiterating what we've seen for generations and generations of parents voting with their heart in protecting their children.
I will say, I think that this trend is going to start going away very soon because there's been a lot of research done on the fact that the younger generation is decreasing the amount of children that they have out of economic stress, out of fear for the future of our country and what kind of future they would be bringing children into. And so I think especially over probably the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be a movement towards voting more for yourself than family. And I think that the issue of children and what happens with our children in this country is always going to be an issue as long as there are children in this country. I do believe, though, that is going to be less significant of an issue in the near future.
I agree.
Our last person we talked to was Mark Croto. We spoke to him at the Nikki Haley meet and greet. Now, this guy lived a couple miles across the border in Massachusetts. He is an independent evangelical Christian who has voted for Biden in the past, but is looking for an alternative from Biden and Trump. He did say that if it were another Trump-Biden election, he would vote for Biden. Jackson, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we also talked about how even though he identifies with conservative values such as being pro-life, a Trump America is not what he wants. He also came with his mother, who is Catholic and Republican, but elected to vote for Biden in the last election, which he stressed was very unusual for her.
I think that's really interesting. I think this sort of is a prime example of a Trump Republican versus a Republican. And I think sometimes in our society today, we lump the two together and they're not the same. I think this is a classic example of people don't necessarily want the Trump-isms. They believe in their Republican core values, and Trump doesn't always emulate that. He's very much for himself and for America, he thinks. And I think this is an example of, Biden might not be your favorite choice, but he's not Trump, and that is a reason not to vote for him.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm really excited about specifically the Republican primaries and how that turns out for the general election. Because I feel like at this point in our history, this is going to be considered a turning point for conservative values. This is where conservatives have the opportunity to say, we want to continue the conservative values that we have held for the last X amount of years, or the conservatives can say, we want to move in the direction of Trump. We want to take the conservative party in a new direction with new values. And so I'm very interested to see specifically how New Hampshire turns out on Tuesday night, because I think that is going to be something that we look back on in the future and say was a monumental moment for the party.
Yeah, and I think one last thing from this conversation with Mark was his comment on Haley's strategy of trying to appease as many voters as possible on both the right, independent, and left, while Trump is creating a niche of sorts.
Yes, one thing I wish that Nikki, I know she can't do what Christie did because she doesn't want to alienate most of the Republican voters, but one of the most amazing things that I can't believe about Trump is that he's actually campaigning on retribution. We're going to get them back.
I mean, that is a packed two sentences. What do you guys take from that? Do you think that Nikki is spreading herself too thin? And what about his claims on Trump's focus on getting back at Democrats and others who oppose him?
I think that is a fair concern about Trump's comments about campaigning on retribution. I mean, he was quoted as saying that day one he wanted to essentially be a dictator and impose his rule on all of his enemies. And so I think that does reflect a large chunk of the conservative voter base, is that they are also scared, along with people who align themselves with the Democrats, that democracy truly is on the ballot and that there really is a lot at stake in terms of letting Trump get into the general election and have the possibility of taking back over power, as opposed to a more old school traditional conservative.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that I really try to wrap my head around as someone who's not a Republican, is these candidates who are running in the presidential Republican primary, in 2020 and 2024, saying Trump is dangerous. He is not going to be good for our country. He, wants to be a dictator, January 6th, all of these things that, are flashing lights that he is not a good candidate. And yet, you see people drop out like Tim Scott, who then endorsed him. You have Nikki Haley, who said, she's open to pardoning him if she is president. I don't understand how two things can be true at once. He's either dangerous or he can be pardoned and America will be safe. I think, too, that is a question that Nikki Haley is going to have to come to terms with fairly soon if she wants to pull some Democratic and independent voters who are, agree that Trump is not what we need and is a dangerous person, and will hold her accountable to saying, pick a side one way and run with that.
Yeah, I think as tough of a reality as it is, Nikki does need to kind of pick a side in terms of whether or not she wants to be in the ring of Trump conservatives, in the ring of supporting Trump's actions and supporting Trump in the future, or if she wants to go to that side that is more conservative, traditional conservative values, that is more anti-Trump, that is kind of fed up with how the last 8 years in terms of what Trump has done to the Republican Party and the races that he has cost them. So, yeah, I think that is a significant thing.
So to wrap up, what do you think people should be taking away from what has happened in New Hampshire so far? Do you think this sets a tone for the next primaries and rallies candidates have?
I think New Hampshire is going to be a real turning point for the Republican primary. I think Iowa, there was not high voter turnout. I think Iowa is a smaller subset of, specific groups. New Hampshire, I think Nikki Haley has a very strong message that she is a stone's throw away from Donald Trump. And I think Tuesday, we're going to see if that's true. And if it is, she's in this race for good. I think in addition to that, DeSantis, how well he does here is going to impact how he does in South Carolina and how much longer he'll be in the race.
Yeah, I know that there's been a lot that's happened on the Democratic side in terms of New Hampshire being slighted, being told that they're not going to have their votes counted. But I really do think that nonetheless, in the Republican primary, New Hampshire has a chance to really set the tone for this election.
Absolutely.
Are they going to be the state that follows Iowa and puts Trump in essentially the driver's seat for the rest of this election? Or are they going to speak up for either DeSantis or Haley and really surprise and get people thinking about, hey, maybe there is an alternative to Trump that is popular enough to beat Joe Biden?